Last Shabbat, a light went out in this world when we lost Elie Wiesel. After this week of violence, I am haunted by Wiesel's words. Whenever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. Wiesel demands that we turn our full hearts and minds to the tragedy at hand. Although we hear so much rhetoric in the mainstream about valuing human life, #Black Lives Matter, we see that these values are not shared or lived out. Actions around us speak loudly, with the deaths of Philando Castile in Minnesota, Alton B. Sterling in Baton Rouge, and the 5 police officers who were shot yesterday in Dallas. These deaths reflect that some lives are not valued. People are persecuted and murdered because of the color of their skin, just as people are still persecuted and killed because of their religion, sexual orientation, and place of birth. In this dark time of loss, I look to Wiesel, his message and his life's work as leading the way to healing and to the possibility of a better world. Wiesel taught us through word and example to never stay silent, but to fight for justice. Upon receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, Wiesel said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." President Obama said of Wiesel, he raised his voice not just against anti-Semitism, but against hatred, bigotry, and intolerance in all of its forms. He implored each of us as nations and as human beings to do the same, to see ourselves in each other, to make real that pledge of never again. Wiesel broke the silence that had descended over America about the Shoah 10 years after the end of the war. Throughout Wiesel's life, people tried to deconstruct his narrative, to reverse it or oppose it by saying that the Holocaust never happened and the like. But he asserted the truth into the mainstream, avowing that he would keep the memory alive and fight for those who would forget. Fight those who would forget. The truth would not be swallowed up by false claims. The struggle to keep the truth from lies is especially relevant in this week's Torah portion. In this story, a Levite named Korach distorted the narrative of Moses being chosen by God as the leader of the people. Instead, Korach accuses Moses and Aaron of raising themselves above all of the Israelites. Korach's narrative gains traction among some 250 important chieftains of the Israelite tribes. Moses warns the rebellious group that God will make clear who is the true one of them whom God has chosen to grant access to God's self. Then God opens up the ground and swallows Korach and his followers. In the context of the Torah, it is clear that Moses did not seek out power or leadership. In fact, it was quite the opposite that had happened. When God asked Moses to go to Egypt to lead the people out of slavery, Moses tried to decline not once, but 4 times. Korach, on the other hand, sought to gain power, and he did so in an underhanded way by distorting the truth, claiming that Moses put himself in charge of the people. Korach sought to gain power by calling into question the main narrative of the people. We are in an election season, and this rhetoric is all around us. We are being asked to call into question our basic assumptions of what we stand for in a quest for power that is all around us. Korach challenged Moses' authority, just as there is a faction undermining the authority of our American narrative as a multicultural and democratic society. In this case, the politics are precarious. That said, democracy by its very nature allows for conflicting perspectives to enter the fray and vie for support. For certain, Israelite society in the Torah was not democratic. But as modern readers, the parsha seems to ask us to consider a strand present in the narrative, which asks, shouldn't all of the Israelites have direct access to God? Might there be a situation in which another way of organizing the community would be valid? And also, can someone other than Moses be the leader? Korach sought to gain power by trying to make a new narrative in which he too, like Moses, could have access to God. The parsha acknowledges the possibility of this. Even though ultimately the prevailing narrative survives, after all, we still call the Torah the 5 books of Moses and not the 2.5 books of Moses and 1.5 of Korach. Korach could not win, because even though it would seem his challenge was valid, this challenge being the question of, why do you, Moses, get to have more power than us, the people, and in particular me, Korach? His motives were less than noble, and he could not win because his selfish focus on personal gain could never have sustained the Israelites through the struggles in the wilderness into forming a sense of peoplehood strong enough to carry them through for generations to come. In the most simplistic terms, Korach was a bad guy in the Torah who would have been ruinous as a leader of the Israelites. And God, the ultimate superhero, comes in and saves the day by having the ground swallow him and his followers up. Today's world is much more complicated. God does not swallow up destructive leaders and arrogant and dangerous racists. We are left to fend for ourselves. And that is why Elie Wiesel and the legacy he left behind is so important in demanding that we are constantly on guard to overturn the human propensity towards violence and intolerance. His example urges us to guard against the twisting of historical fact for personal gain. The slaughter of innocent life happens again and again, as it did this week. And we must speak out, and we must speak out loudly for the value of each life. We are all children of God. Today's world is much more complicated. God does not swallow up those who attempt to rewrite history. We are left to fend for ourselves. What should be our response to denials of the Holocaust? What will happen when the last Holocaust survivor dies? When there is no one left to stand witness to this truth? And history, with a capital letter H, which we sometimes think of as being carved in stone, in reality is more like a plastic that can bend or even be recycled. Imagine what history would be taught in school had Germany won World War II. A most essential and perhaps obvious task is to talk to our children. Recently, a parent mentioned to me that he did not want to tell his children about the Shoah, which may be understandable. I remember after Sandy Hook, I had to talk with children about what had occurred, and it was uncomfortable, and the advice I took was to mention just enough facts and avoid giving graphic details, but really let them lead the way. If a child is ready, he or she will ask questions. But we need to do those things, which are uncomfortable when they are this important. If we talk to our children, then the memory continues, and they can come to realize why it is crucial for us as Jews to speak up for the victim, to speak up for the oppressed, for those suffering injustice at the hands of those wielding power. And this is what Wiesel did. Wiesel spoke out for others, and yet he was very sensitive that he could not fully represent another's deepest truths. It was that insight, that sensitivity, that made him such a powerful voice. In the New York Times, in an interview in 1981, Wiesel said, "If I survived, it must be for some reason. I must do something with my life. It is too serious to play games with anymore, because in my place, someone else could have been saved. And so I speak for that person. On the other hand, I know I cannot." Wiesel empowered those who were in weak positions by giving voice to their truths, by giving them access, by demanding that we take notice of them as having equal rights. What would Wiesel offer us about today's horrific events? Like us, he would undoubtedly be heartsick over the brutal slaying and wounding of innocent civilians and officers. He would push us as a society and as individuals to embody this belief that all lives matter through our actions and not just through our slogans. So what does it mean that Wiesel is gone? Sarah Barden, a preschool teacher attending his funeral, who only knew him through his works, said, "He was someone who protected us. He interceded against our worst instincts." And I think she spoke for many of us when she said, "The world feels like a more vulnerable place without him." The rabbis teach that Kol Yisrael Aravim Ze Bazeh. We are all responsible for one another. The killing of innocents obligates us to raise our voices. As Wiesel taught, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. So I leave you with this. How are we speaking for those whose voices are suppressed? How are we speaking for those who cannot speak? Shabbat Shalom.